How would you describe them?
Non-fiction works of genius.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Clearly a master of words. How good is that? But prior to Bill being invited here, which was really Martin Marr's idea, who you might know Martin Marr, who used to be the chairman of our board of the Marr family, because we'd had this long history of having Nobel laureates or near Nobel laureates coming along to give the Kenneth Marr lecture. And he said, look, there's this chap, Bill Bryson. I said, Bill Bryson, I love those books, Bill Bryson's books, and I've been reading them for years. And the first one I read was the one when I was in the UK in 2004 on sabbatical about the little island. It was called... No Small Island. Yeah. And it was so good, I then started reading all the other ones. The most recent one I read was The Thunderbolt Kid, and the one before that was the one on Shakespeare. I thought that was a great little book, wasn't it?
Well, thank you. Thank you.
That was a really... you should read that one. It just explains all about Shakespeare in simple language. It's riveting. So what we might do, Bill, is do you want to do a reading or...
Well, I'm happy to do whatever you want to do, but I did bring along a passage because I was told to prepare something to read.
And is there a particular reason why you chose this passage?
Yes, because it should make all scientists feel better. No matter how bad things are going for you at work, there's going to always be somebody where something worse has happened to. And this is from the short history of nearly everything, and it was, I think, the saddest story in the whole book. It's nothing to do with the kind of science you do, but it was about, in the 18th century, they realized that if they could measure an event called the transit of Venus, which is just when the planet Venus moves across the face of the sun, through sort of clever triangulation, if they got lots of measurements from all over the planet, by some method of triangulation, they could work out how far away Earth was from the sun and from all other celestial bodies. And so that for the first time in history, they would know whether, we were 10 million miles from the moon, or 150 million miles, or whatever distance. I mean, before that, they had absolutely zero idea how big our own solar system was, how much space there was out there. So this was a tremendously exciting thing, but it was also, because of the time in which it was done, it was really, really challenging. And transits to Venus happen only every century or so. They happen twice, 8 years apart, and then they don't happen at all again for another century. So it was really important that they got the measurements exactly right, and they were only going to get, this one very brief chance to do it and another 8 years later. But if they didn't get it right during those two chances, then they'd have to wait another century. And so it was really important to the world to try and get this right. With the instinct for ordeal that characterized the Edge, scientists set off for more than 100 locations all around the globe, to Siberia, China, South Africa, Indonesia, and the woods of Wisconsin, among many others. France dispatched 32 observers, Britain 18 more, and still others set off from Sweden, Russia, Italy, Germany, Ireland, and elsewhere. It was history's first cooperative international scientific venture, and almost everywhere it ran into problems. Many observers were waylaid by war, sickness, or shipwreck. Others made their destinations, but opened their crates to find equipment broken or warped by tropical heat. Once again, the French seemed fated to provide the most memorably unlucky participants. Jean Chap spent months traveling to Siberia by coach, boat, and sleigh, nursing his delicate instruments over every perilous bump, only to find the last vital stretch blocked by swollen rivers, the results of unusually heavy spring rains. Which the locals were swift to blame on him after they saw him pointing strange instruments at the sky. Chap managed to escape with his life, but with no useful measurements. Unluckier still was Guillaume Le Gentil, whose experiences are wonderfully summarized by Timothy Ferris in the book Coming of Age in the Milky Way. Le Gentil set off from France a full year ahead of time to observe the transit from India, but various setbacks along the way left him still at sea on the day of the transit, just about the worst place to be since steady measurements were impossible on a pitching ship. Undaunted, Le Gentil continued on to India to await the next transit in 1769. With 8 years to prepare, He erected a first-rate buoy station, tested and retested his instruments endlessly, and had everything in a state of perfect readiness for the second transit. On the morning of the second transit, the 4th of June, 1769, he awoke to a fine day. But just as Venus began its pass, a cloud slid in front of the sun and remained there for almost exactly the duration of the transit of 3 hours, 14 minutes, and 7 seconds.
Sounds like an experiment.
Stoically, Le Gentil packed up his instruments and set off for the nearest port, but en route he contracted dysentery and was laid up for nearly a year. Still weakened, he finally made it onto a ship. It was nearly wrecked in a hurricane off the African coast. When at last he reached home, 11.5 years after setting off, and having achieved nothing, he discovered that his relatives had had him declared dead in his absence and had enthusiastically plundered his estate. So I hope that makes you all feel better.
Yeah, thinking of the standard experimental laboratory when you're doing that, if it's going to go wrong, it goes wrong, doesn't it? Can you remember writing that?
Yeah, I remember. Yes, I remember. I can pretty much remember, working on the book and doing it, but I can never remember, as particularly after such a length of time, are the details of things, the dates, and exactly the sorts of things that you get asked about in interviews. But I forget anything that isn't, other than just the generalities.
Yes. It was Cook also who was went with Joseph Banks to look at the transit.
Yeah, they were part of the same time as well, and they were part of the same thing, and they actually did quite well.
They did better than.
They did a lot better than that. Yeah. But it needed lots and lots of measurements all over. I don't understand the science well enough to explain why, but it partly because I imagine because the instruments were such that you needed an awful lot of data in order to be able to kind of round out errors and timings, because it had to be extremely precise in terms of the timings of it as well, to get even approximate figures. So I think it was quite interesting that suddenly the whole world, people were prepared to take the kind of risks with their own lives in order to go off just for the sake of accumulating knowledge.
Could I ask you, and then I'll throw it open, other people might want to ask questions as well. You've got such a good grasp of the concepts of science. There's a whole chapter on the cell, for example, which is beautifully sets out how the cell works and how it was discovered and whatnot. Why didn't you go into science when you were at school? And then, well, you went to university and then you dropped out. And I was hoping actually, as I was reading, that you might have stayed dropped out, but you actually went back. You actually went back and finished your degree, didn't you? When you went back into.
I went back. It took me 7 years to do a 4-year course because I kept dropping out. And I had no enthusiasm for college at all. I just wanted to go out and live and get out into the real world. And I didn't have any real. I wasn't drawn to academic life at all, particularly. I enjoyed certain aspects of it, but I didn't like the kind of imposed discipline in that, that I have to study 17th century France now because that's what the syllabus declares. I wanted to be able to do what I wanted to do in my own time. So it wasn't as if I was against learning, I just didn't like the structured way that higher education did it in America at that time. So
this was in Des Moines.
This was in Des Moines. And with respect to science, I had just never connected with science in an academic way. I found, or with maths or anything technical, I was totally related to the humanities and nothing else. Partly, I think, because science was taught in such a dull way in schools when I was there. The experience I had again and again when I was doing the research for Short History, Nearly Everything, is I would come across some fact, I would learn some amazing thing, and I would read this and think, well, why didn't they tell me this in school? I'd have paid attention if they were teaching me this kind of thing. Because there is so much that's so interesting. And as I think I was telling you yesterday, the reason I went and did the book in the end was because I had this conviction that although I had been a complete failure at the sciences in school, I was certain that there had to be some level at which I could personally engage with science, because science obviously explains everything. And I'm as curious as the next person if you're going to know, who you are and where you came from and where you're going and all of those kinds of things, it's science that will provide the answers. So, so it's obviously got to be relevant and exciting and interesting at some level to every single person. And that was the whole idea of the book, that was my quest to find out at what level I could engage with science. And what I found was that I was still never going to get anywhere with equations and formulas and things like that. But I could certainly appreciate what the people who can get a lot out of equations and formulas and that kind of very serious thinking, what they can achieve for us.
Does anyone want to butt in? Here we are, yes.
Thanks for coming out to speak to us today, Mr. Bryson. I just wanted to ask a question on behalf of John.
I think we can hear you almost.
Yeah, just so everyone can hear you.
I just wanted to ask a question on behalf of the Masters and PhD students that are currently writing their thesis at the moment. If you have any suggestions for getting through writer's block.
Well, I don't know. It's a very good question. No, I don't. If you've got any suggestions, you tell me. I mean, I'm lucky. I've never really, meaningfully experienced that. And to me, writing is always just been a job. I grew up in a newspaper household. Everybody in my family, that's what we did, and you just worked on newspapers, and you had assignments, and you did them, and you did an assignment, and then you moved on to the next one. And so I've always had that kind of mentality, which is lucky because I don't get too caught up in what I'm trying to do. It just seems a bit of work I've got to do each day of my life. But I don't know if this would be alarming to you or comforting to you, but after all these years and 30 years or so of writing more or less full time, every morning when I get up and look at the computer screen that's blank, my heart sinks. Because it is the hardest thing in the world. I think it's an interesting thing, and this is something perhaps you guys can tell me, because it's always struck me as it is an odd thing that we have this fantastic instrument in our head, the human brain, that can do all kinds of things, and yet we really slightly dread making it work. And I've never quite understood why that is. Well, I mean, what is every person in the world, as soon as you get an opportunity to just go into some kind of passive mode and just look at flickering images on a screen or listen to music and put, earpieces in your ears and not use your brain, that's kind of what we all rush to do. And I've never really understood why that is. I think it's a fascinating question because what I've always found with work is that, the first thing in the morning, I don't want to use my brain. It's hard. It just feels like, this is a kind of hump you have to get over. And then, as I'm sure you all agree, the most amazing thing happens is you start working and you get into it, and then you don't want to stop. You get caught up in it, and then it becomes exciting. But I have never understood why it is that we have to, get over that hump every time.
You need on and off times, don't you? You need the balance a bit. Sorry.
You need a bit of a balance. You need a bit of rest time as well for you.
No, absolutely. But it just seems to me as if the typical, the average human being, including an awful lot of very smart human beings, the first thing they do is, at the first opportunity, they turn their brain off. I mean, they stop using it. It's like we want to rest it all the time. Maybe it's just because it's such an expensive organ to keep running. But I mean, just think how much of your life, even some of the smartest people in Victoria, I just think how much of your own personal life you just sit there kind of mindlessly, either watching a movie or doing Sudoku or doing just something that's kind of just filling time, fooling around. I just think it's kind of curious.
Yeah, hi Bill. Toby Cummings, my name. I see a bit of your authorship career in the trajectory of my own life, and let me describe to you why. I did my PhD in England, and around that time, before it I spent about 6 months travelling the world, and then after it I spent another 6 months travelling elsewhere. And after about that half year, I love travelling, I love meeting people, I love different countries, but I felt like ultimately maybe it was a sort of frivolous and selfish pursuit. Like once I got 6 months in, it seemed all about me and I wasn't really contributing much. And now I spend my whole life doing science, and I feel like that I like it as much as travelling, but maybe it's a less self-centred pursuit. So I mean, is that the point that you got to after writing your travel books and now the science books?
Oh, I was wondering how you were pulling me into this. No, I mean, what happened with me was that I just wanted to write for a living, and I mean, it was something that I'd always wanted to do. I just wanted to see if I could actually support myself and a family through writing, and I didn't really have any kinds of books in mind to do. I just thought that by being a writer and books and magazine articles and all kinds of things, it would just, it would provide an interest in life, and it would be something that I would find fulfilling and challenging and rewarding. So when I set off to write books, I wasn't thinking of myself as becoming a travel writer or anything like that. But it just happened that the first book I wrote, which was called The Lost Continent, and that was about going back to America after living in England for a long time and just seeing my native country from the slightly new perspective of someone who'd lived abroad for a long time. That did really well. And I mean, it got good reviews and it got noticed. And so the publishers told me, my publisher in London, told me for the next book, he said, well, you've got to do a travel book. You've got to, you write travel books now. That's what you do. And and that's what I started doing and kind of did for a while, because that was what they were not exactly making me do, but you get coaxed into it, and it becomes, what you find with publishers is that when you have a book that's successful, then all the publishers want you to do is just that same book over and over and over again. And I mean, my first successful book in America was A Walk in the Woods, which was about trying to hike the Appalachian Trail. And it did really well in the States. And when I went to the publisher with my next idea for a book, which happened to be to do a book on Australia, he said, no, you've got to go and find a hiking companion and go walk somewhere else, go do, another long distance. And I really didn't want to get locked into just doing the same thing over and over again. And eventually with the travel books, I really did kind of feel like I had mined that vein. It was running a bit thin, making jokes about going to a country and being slightly befuddled and confounded by what I found there. So I just thought I'd really like to have a change to do something else. But that's when I did A Short History of Nearly Everything, and the publishers were really, really very nervous about it. I mean, it was good of them to let me do it, but they really thought that they were allowing me to do this thing that I would then get out of my system, and I would go back to doing, just funny books in which I go to a new country and get drunk and make a fool of myself.
Was there an epiphany where you said, you've been writing travel books, and then thought, I'm going to write this book about science?
Well, I'd always wanted to do several books. I mean, there were always several kinds of books that I wanted to do. And a science book, me trying to understand science was a book that I thought, for a long time, I'd really enjoy doing that. Because sitting in England, I would sit and watch Horizon and Equinox and all these science programs. I would enjoy them very much. As long as you were presenting science to me in an interesting way that seemed to explain, my place in the universe, I was fascinated. And so I thought I'd really like to, correct this deficiency in my knowledge to whatever extent I can. So that was something I'd wanted to do for a long time. I'd also, for a long time, have wanted to do a book on baseball that has a big baseball element in it. I'm doing that now. And I've also, for a very long time, I've wanted to do a book on Canada. And nobody wants to read a book on Canada. Nobody wants. Canadians won't read books on Canada. So publishers always beg you to do anything else other than a book on Canada. But I find Canada fascinating. In much the same way I find Australia fascinating, in just that, but more so in a way because Canada was right on top of us all the time I'm growing up. There's this country up there that we didn't pay any attention to, and still most Americans couldn't tell you, who's the Prime Minister of Canada or anything like that. And I just find it fascinating because it's obviously such an agreeable country, and it's nice people, and it's got a fascinating history of its own, and yet we pay no attention to it. And so I'd kind of like to go and have a good look at it.
Hi Bill, Emma. I think science communication is really hard, and it's admirable that you can do it so well. I was just wondering if you might be able to part with a few maybe tips for us scientists, because scientists are not notoriously known for communicating to the general public, and I think it's because we tend to be quite meticulous, and we understand that experiment X requires maybe 15 hours at a time cutting slices of brain. It's the same thing over and over again, and we understand that that's important for our experiment, but it's also very, very boring. But in order to communicate science, I think the public need to realise that it does take a long time and that we're not having eureka moments every sort of left, right and centre. And I think that that's what we focus on a lot, at least the media focus on these eureka moments. And it's not really accurately portraying what we do, and therefore it makes it harder for us to say, well, actually we need more money. We need more time to have that eureka moment.
I knew it would come down to that.
Any tips for us?
Well, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I learned I had never stopped to think about, it's pretty self-evident if you do stop to think about it, but, you know, science, we do tend to think of science as the kind of Einsteins and Newtons and all the, you know, these colossal figures that do amazingly revolutionary things. But in fact, you know, in any area of human knowledge, it's going to really be much more of a kind of an accretion of little bits, little facts done by hundreds of thousands of people doing much smaller things, not having revolutionary moments, but just adding to this great heap that is, you know, human knowledge. And that to me was just quite an amazing thought. And one of the things that I genuinely most admire about scientists is that discipline that allows you to do something, to spend your whole life, for years and years, just slicing, you know, human brains into tiny tissues, you know, day after day, or for people who can go out and spend a whole lifetime just studying lichens or mosses, or that kind of you know, fixation is so important. I mean, the world needs people to do that, and I'm fascinated by it because I just couldn't do that. I'm too much of a sort of magpie character. It's why I lurch from subject to subject in books. I have to keep moving on. I get bored, and so that's fascinating. But one of the things that I always find when I come to a place like this, and I was chatting to a few of you earlier, is that when you start talking to you about what you do as individuals, what each of you do, you know, I'm not just being polite. It is actually really interesting. And as soon as you find out, you know, why are you doing what you're doing, and why do you slice, you know, brains up like that? What are you trying to find out? And actually, when you stop and start telling people what it is you do as individuals, it is fascinating, and you shouldn't lose sight of that. And you shouldn't apologize for it or think of it as being dull, because it's tremendously exciting. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than the brain and working out how the human mind works. So you're, you know, already in the best field that possibly could be. But even no matter how sort of arcane and specific and really, you know, just sort of neurological your area, it still is leading to something that's really, really important, which is just a little bit more of human knowledge. So you should never apologize to people. And when people ask you what you do, you should tell them with great excitement, because you know, because it is exciting. It's why you decided to do it. You know, you didn't decide to do it because somebody instructed you to. You decided to do it because you found something that excited you. And really the whole trick of it is just to convey that to the world when you start talking about it.
Bill, my name is Brian. Look, the first thought I had after finishing history of nearly everything was, this book must have taken an army of research assistants. Am I right?
No, I did do all the, I mean, I did the research myself, but I got a lot of help in terms of going to various academics and specialists and having them very patiently explain things to me. Because not only was it a matter of understanding at least the rudiments of a lot of things, but then I had to figure out some way of expressing it in a novel way so that I wasn't just plagiarizing others who'd written about this earlier. And I often found that's the really hard part, is how do you describe, you know, sort of what's going on in a cell or some kind of mental activity or something in a way that, you know, Stephen Jay Gould didn't do it earlier, or Richard Dawkins or somebody like, you know, in a way that is fresh and original, but is still correct, because I was never quite sure if I was, you know, deviating from accuracy. So I needed a lot of help in that sense. But in terms of the research, I did it all myself, but not because I didn't want to use a lot of researchers. I mean, I could have benefited in a lot of ways, but it just seemed to me that you can't say to any person, however bright and dedicated and diligent, you can't say to that person, go into the library and find some stuff that's going to excite me, you know? And that's what I needed, was to be looking through books, and I would just look through a lot of really quite dull or difficult, challenging textbook type books, but then there's some little footnote that tells you about, you know, Guillaume Le Gentil and everything that went wrong in his life. And it's just a passing reference in the book. And to me, that's when, you know, the light bulb lights up above my head, and I think, oh, I'd really like to know more about that. But I don't see how you could ask a researcher to go out and find that kind of thing. You have to stumble across that yourself. Anyway, that's the most fun part of writing a book is those moments when you find something that you think is just right for what you're looking for.
Well, some of the facts are extraordinary. I mean, how do you find out that Henry Cavendish was such a shy man he used to run away if somebody came to the door? You know, things like that.
Oh, well, it's easy. That's easy. You just read the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. You just look up Henry Cavendish. And, but what happens is, with people who write textbooks, when they write about Henry Cavendish, they don't write about that side of it. They don't write about his personality. Yeah. So a lot of what I was doing, it was simply looking at the humans behind the stories. And as I said in the book, a lot of what I was doing wasn't just trying to figure out what science know, but how do they know what they know? How did people figure these things out? What was it that was going on? You know, why was it Einstein what was it about him and his life and his own circumstances that made him, you know, come up with relativity rather than some other person? So what was it? Is there something special in his circumstances? And once you start looking at their life story, you may not know whether there is something special in circumstances that made them come to a certain, to come to certain conclusions. But what you do find out is that they had, you know, an interesting and individual life, which does, you know, illuminate what they did in some way.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And Bill,
Any other questions?
you worked as a journalist for a while, didn't you?
Oh, sorry. Apologies.
Was it you finished the degree and then went back to the UK and you worked with several newspapers in London, is that right?
Yeah, well, what I did was I started off at college at university in Des Moines, my hometown, and then I dropped out. I was just dropping out for a semester, and then went off to hitchhike around Europe. And I was supposed to come home after 4 months, and I stayed for 2 years and met a student nurse at a psychiatric hospital who's my wife. And sort of my whole life changed from having met her. And so I stayed in Europe. I stayed in England for 2 years at that point, while she finished her training as a nurse's training. And then we got married and went back to Des Moines as a man and wife, and then I finished at university. And when I finished at university, then we came back to England again and stayed that time for 18 years. And during that time I worked on newspapers. I started on a little evening newspaper in Bournemouth on the south coast, and then kind of gradually worked my way up to Fleet Street, and I worked for 8 years on the Times. 8 years on the Times, and then I worked on the Independent for his first 2 years. And at that point, then I decided that I really wanted to try to make a living freelancing. And so that was in '87.
Could I ask you two things? One, which book do you like best? And two, which has been the most successful?
That's
or are they the same?
Yeah, well, sometimes they are. I mean, it's a really hard question to answer, because it is a little bit, you know, they are a little bit like your children, and it's, you know, if we say to you, which is your favorite child, it's not an easy question to answer. So I have great fondness for every one of them. But I think, in a lot of ways, the one that's been most successful, and all over, I mean, in terms of foreign languages and everything, is The Short History of Nearly Everything. That's the one that did really well all over the world. A lot of others do, they'll do really well in one country or one kind of country, but and not so well in others. Travel books never do well in the States, for instance. They're not. My book on Australia did really well in the States, right up until the Sydney Olympics. It came out just in time for the Sydney Olympics. It did really, really well. And then the Olympics finished, and the books stopped selling immediately. It was like, well, that's Australia. We don't need to be paying attention to it now. Whereas it's gone on and on and on in Britain and the Commonwealth, the rest of the Commonwealth. So in terms of success, the Short History of Nearly Everything has been the best. And in a lot of ways, I mean, I think that's the book that has done the most for me, and has got, you know, it's the book that's allowed me to end up in a situation like this. And so I'm very grateful to it and what it's done for me.
Well, I might add, you might not know this, but Bill was invited to become Chancellor of the University of Durham in 2005 and only just relinquished it last year, I think you were telling me, and also received the Aventus Prize from, was that from the Royal Society of Chemistry?
No, just Royal Society.
Royal Society, and also there's another one from the Royal Society of Chemistry, I think, about promoting the physical sciences or the chemical sciences. So he's certainly been recognised for making a major contribution in communication about science. So I think it's been, this for us was an experiment, having a science communicator rather than a scientist, and I think already it's just been a remarkable success, and I can see that we're not going to stick to just scientists from now on. We certainly will have scientists, but I think we need to give equal credence to those who communicate science, and I think the reason I feel quite strongly about that is a point that Emma was making. I think that it's okay to do the science, but then you need to communicate it. And if you don't communicate it, it's as good as not doing it. So it's just as important as the science itself. So perhaps on behalf of all of us, if you could join with me thanking Bill. I've noticed you haven't got a cup of tea yet.
I've got one over there.
I've got one over there. I think it's very important that you're allowed to get another one. And you might like to keep chatting to Bill and perhaps have another cup and even a cake. So thanks everyone. It's been, and Bill, thanks to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.